David Holmgren.
David was Bill's student. Bill was the university professor searching for a meaning for everything. He was a lecturer guy. He was a personality. He was a speaker going around and getting people to think about big ideas and thinking about big whole systems and holistic thinking. And he was trying to come up with a theory for everything. And this amazing student came along named David Holmgren. And David really is an incredible person. David was 17 when he was writing his thesis, and he started writing about permaculture. And so together they turned it into a book, and they co-authored the book. And that book is where the term permaculture comes from. So David is much younger than Bill. Bill has passed away. David is still with us. And David, his ideas really have structured and pushed permaculture from a unique space, a quiet kind of humble space.
I'm David Holmgren, and I'm best known as the co-originator of the permaculture concept in the 1970s with Bill Mollison. Sometimes there's two stories that are told about how the idea of permaculture really came about. One story is that Mollison was my supervising academic and I was just some technical assistant who worked with him. And then there's the opposite of that, which is I was the brilliant student and he was the academic who stole my work, which neither of those are true. I mean, for a start, he was my mentor while I was working on that permaculture manuscript. But if it had been left to me, the permaculture manuscript would have just mouldered away in a drawer. It was Bill who was like, no, we're going to take this to the world. The core of the idea of permaculture really came about when I was coming towards the end of my first year in environmental design. And my interests were gravitating around ecology, agriculture, and landscape design. And I could see how two of these connected, but I couldn't see anywhere where the three crossed over and intersected. So I wanted to look at that. At a seminar about how land is owned and controlled, there was a bloke there who said some really interesting things. He pointed out that the rabbit problem in Australia could have been solved by rabbit trappers, but they had no incentive to do so because they didn't benefit from the land being in better condition from there being less rabbits. So what did they do? They farmed the rabbits on the farmer's land. So he was pointing out that the ownership of the land had this really adverse effect on the sustainability of the land. I thought, God, this guy thinks just completely different to the academic ecologists I'd met. And that was Bill Mollison. I got chatting with him afterwards, and I was actually developed this relationship with him, moved into his house, and we were discussing my plans for this focus in my course in the second year. And I said, well, I'm interested in this intersection between ecology, agriculture, and landscape design, and how natural systems could influence that. And he said, oh, how about this for an idea then? If most places on the planet, nature creates a forest, why doesn't our agriculture, if not look like a forest, function something like a forest? Why is our agriculture all composed of only annual plants that grow and die in one year? Whereas in nature, there's a diversity. And that's exactly in that intersection. And I said, that's exactly what I'm interested in. By understanding how nature designs things, we can create permanent agriculture and permanent culture in everything we do. And that became permaculture.
It comes from two Latin words, permanens, to persist through time, and culture, an activity that supports human existence. So put those together, it's a persistent system that supports human existence.
And that became the beginnings of a passionate, full-time, total immersion with Mollison effectively as my informal mentor, no relationship in my academic work, to an intensive study that led to the Permaculture manuscript, which was later published as Permaculture 1 in 1978 and was the starting point of permaculture as a public concept. So it's something that emerged between the two of us at a time when there was a huge wave of interest in what we might call sustainable solutions today. Before the term sustainability actually was in the lexicon, before there was any serious discussion of the limits of the environment reflected in pollution and biodiversity loss and land degradation. So permaculture came out of that, what I call that sort of first wave of modern environmentalism, and not just oppositional environmentalism, but very much the positive environmentalism of what are the solutions, and even more so than that, not just what are the solutions that those at the top should implement, but how are we just going to go out and create the world we do want and the work that is the world which is sustainable.
David Holmgren went with his family and they just lived off the land and put this stuff, into real action. Meliodora is a wonderful book if you can find it. He goes over an actual example of doing this stuff, and he doesn't have it be theory, he has it be real.
So Bill was my mentor. We were developing the first permaculture garden on the fringes of Hobart and persuaded me that we should publish it. But I didn't have a lot of the experience in all the different fields that underpin permaculture. And so my passion was about doing those things and building Meliodora here. I was only in my early 20s and I wanted to actually ground all these ideas in the huge practicality of ecological building, of organic gardening and agroforestry systems and aquaculture and all the practical skills, as well as of course the design processes that permaculture was about. So I put myself through a really intensive self-teaching education process that has never stopped. Whereas Bill was ready for a larger stage and taking permaculture to the world was his next agenda, and develop the beginning of the permaculture design course. And that mechanism was really how permaculture spread, not just in Australia, but around the world. So although I was the co-originator of the permaculture concept, Bill was the father of the permaculture movement.
So how are you using permaculture now?
Well, of course, permaculture has been with me since Bill Mollison and I co-originated the concept in the early 70s when I was in my late teens as a student. So it's been with me my whole life. At various times early on I imagined getting away from it, I suppose around some of the concerns about how permaculture was being promoted. I think any concept that really provides a galvanising framework of meaning and value in people's lives, which permaculture certainly has been, always has that danger of turning into dogma or rigid view, where rather than the essence of the ideas, some crystallised exact formula becomes what people hold on to. But I've always been very serious that permaculture ways of thinking represent real power, and I am not using permaculture in some sort of arm's length way. It's like in here. I ended up with a personal reputation in the early decades of permaculture for being a practical person who just went on quietly and did things in permaculture rather than talking about them, while Bill Mollison was of course taking permaculture to the world. But for me, a lot of that was really the discipline of actually reconnection to practical things, because I know I'm actually the sort of person that my head can drift off into the clouds. Right. Along the way, I've earned a very modest livelihood doing consultancy work and teaching, and in more recent years publishing. And since the mid-80s, myself and my partner Sue Dennett have been here in central Victoria developing this very modest small property of about 1 hectare as our home, and being involved in various ancillary and complementary projects in our local community, while occasionally venturing out into the wider world, very occasionally overseas. Mostly, I suppose, taking advantage of the amazing world that we can live a home-based, simple lifestyle that's highly resilient and incredibly rich and rewarding at home, in a place away from the centres of power and wealth, and yet still be connected to the world and have influence in the world. I suppose the core of permaculture thinking is that we are a subset of nature. The principles that govern what we do are, in the broadest sense, are the same principles that govern nature. Before the huge, exceptional, unusual, maybe interesting, maybe completely dysfunctional aspects that have happened in modernity, understanding how people lived in traditional and indigenous societies is one of the core ideas of permaculture, in the same way that we study how did people actually grow food or gather from the environment as a way of informing how we should design new ecological models. So that part of that lineage is saying, look, a lot of the thinking that we've developed in what's called the European Enlightenment and in a lot of modern ideas of thinking, there are other perspectives. Day-to-day working with nature is that constant sort of lesson and the constant reminder of what the rules of nature are and how she works and how we're all constrained by it, and reduces that tendency to hubris and thinking in that way, because gardening is the activity that most directly connects us with nature at the same time of providing essential things that we need in inefficient ways. But it sort of constantly reminds us about mystery of things, about complexity, about diversity, that we're not really in control, we're just a player in a larger scheme of things. And it forces us to deal with what Mollison's now famous thing about the problem is the solution in permaculture. That idea of the problem is the solution, classically a weed, a pest that you are constantly fighting against, is in some way a lesson that you need to learn in some way. And so often we find, well, a weed is actually a healer of the soil, or it's reversing some damage we've done. And it doesn't necessarily mean we just have to go, oh yeah, whatever grows is fine. But there's a learning for us in those things, and that is shifting that how we struggle against something with sort of vicious cycles often of attempting to address a problem and then sort of having a success but actually end up making it worse in some larger context, to a virtuous cycle where we do something and gain a benefit, and that actually makes a larger benefit for a larger number of participants, and that goes on to make a greater benefit. So that sort of vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle. So the concept of reading landscape, which I've been teaching for decades in permaculture, came about when I realised how much we needed to learn by direct observation that we couldn't learn from books or couldn't learn by being told something by people, and that people's skills, my own skills in being able to open oneself to what is around and connect with that, and to be able to see not just what is, but what was here yesterday by the sign of what is, or what was here 10 years ago, to actually be aware of all that, not just in some intellectual way because you sort of read it in a book, but to gradually build up that pattern language of the environment around you. And this was actually an essential skill for people who were wanting to be permaculture designers, because in fact there was a limited amount of documented knowledge and limited amount of what you could learn from, just talk to the person who's like 5th generation on that site, because they didn't exist or weren't around. And I think that is perhaps connected, a stepping stone towards that opening of what becomes even intuitive connection and perhaps even spiritual connection, even though that's not my framework or starting point. Sue always says that I actually do have quite an intuitive ability, but I'm come from a background of being a super rationalist. And it's certainly very true that a lot of the best understandings that I've been able to develop have been through this working relationship with nature, rather than just repetitively, oh yeah, we did that every year in the last year and therefore we know X, Y and Z. Not just that, lessons learnt from hard-won experience, but being able to see by a contemplative awareness of actually taking the time, the sort of tradition that came out of field naturalism that, well, no, we don't want to particularly know to do some particular task, or we're just curious, to understand nature, to see what happens, and that then we start to see all the patterns and understand connections, and to see the signs of things from the past. And then of course the next level is to actually imagine where nature is going. Like, what will it look like in another 100 years? So I think there is a connection between that and Indigenous ways of understanding the landscape and understanding, perhaps then also flowing over into other people. And in teaching reading landscape, I say to people, look, we all have some skills in this, just the way we all have some skills at reading people. Some of us are good at it, some of us are not so good at it, and we all can get better at it. So I think those things are a part of permaculture. And in reading landscape, I've taught that if we are in a rush till we want to achieve some goal, then this doesn't sort of really help. We've got to be prepared to be just open, and we accumulate understanding that turns out to be useful in some context over time. But if we're goal-oriented and in a rush, then, you know, it's better to go off and get the recipe out of the book or do what you're told, or, you know, because people go, how can I learn by just staring at, you know, what's going on? You know, what is it? Where's the answer? Just tell me. And so that, no, it's just the answer is to that deeper awareness. Now, part of my caution, of course, is we can project all our emotions and our angsts and into those things and say, oh, I just had the feeling that this was exactly the right place for me. Oh yeah, it was a sunny day in spring. And, you know, so that what could be the deep intuition could maybe be superficial emotional fluff and prejudice and whatever. So I remain this sort of skeptical, that sort of scientific skeptic about the insights that come, because they are not like the transparency of science. Oh yeah, that's self-replicable. That's been done. Yes, it's repeatable science. It's not like that, but I think it's real. And it's yes, it's a way of working that is a deeper wisdom that works when we slow down, when we attune ourselves more. I talk about how our senses are all turned down because of the harsh on-off digital, bright, heavy sensory input from our industrial urban world. Whereas you take teenagers out into nature and they go, what's going on? There's nothing happening. You know, because we need to turn up the volume, turn up the sensitivity to see the subtle, the small, the slow-moving things. And maybe that's the same with people. What is what's the really underlying thing that is behind what someone is saying? Where are they coming from? What is their history, their lineage? You know, what pain are they carrying, you know, as they, you know, or what hidden powers do they have that we can't see? You know, capabilities or, and yeah, people can be completely surprising, I suppose, in the same way that nature can be. So, yeah, maybe there's a strong connection there.
You know, in terms of society, what do you think are some of the important lessons?
I think the issue of focusing on particular individual problems in society that we need to reform or address is part of an old progress notion that we're sort of gradually improving things. Whereas when we understand sustainability, then we see we need to redesign everything from first principles. We started with agriculture because that is our working relationship with nature that provides our basic needs. Permaculture does lead us into questioning, in a sense, almost everything, which is difficult because it's an unstable position to be in, and it's a very exhausting position to be in. But it's also amazingly empowering, the idea that in these generations, at this point in history, we actually have the power and the possibility to actually not just redesign our own lives, but through that process actually contribute to a huge cultural, civilizational transformation. As you said, I've always been the skeptic and, like the kicker of sacred cows within permaculture, and I'm always in some ways continue to be, a critic of the movement. But when I look around the world, it still seems to be the best framework out there for the transition we need.